During 2009, we seem to have been permanently on storm watch. Now, this is the last economic update of 2009 into 2010. Joining me today, as usual, is Professor Joe Nellis. Now, Joe, can we step down from storm watch?
I wouldn't step down just yet. We are at a turning point, and this has been, as you've said, a difficult year. And it's been probably as difficult as we expected. I think the surprise has been that the turning point has been slower in coming. And so I wouldn't step down just yet. I mean, remember, from peak to trough, this economy has shrunk by around 6%. That's the biggest drop since official records began. It's also the longest recession since records began in 55. So, no, it's too early to stand down. A cautious optimism is all I'd recommend at the moment.
Now, some people are saying that this crisis has been like no other. Is that so?
Absolutely true. In the UK, that is. Japan has gone through a similar crisis over the last 2 decades. In other words, the difference is this is a financially driven crisis, not a normal business cycle. And because it's financially driven, that's the blood of the economy. And that blood is still not flowing, to use the analogy we used in the past. So this is a special one. And it will be some time before we can put this behind us. And I think next year we'll see recovery, but it'll still be a testing year.
So let's unpack that a bit more. 2010, what are the key elements that you'd look for to see whether things are getting better or worse?
Well, first of all, the headline figure, GDP growth. The fourth quarter figure will come out in about 6 weeks' time. We're expecting, surely, that will be positive, very small positive. So for 2010 as a whole, perhaps the consensus view, and I use that very carefully, is growth of about 1% for the year as a whole. Now that is in contrast to the Treasury's own forecast, which is 1.5%. But the Treasury has been wrong so far. And so if we take theirs as the optimistic scenario, 1% as the perhaps realistic scenario, we'll be somewhere round about that figure, I presume. The other headline figures you mentioned, inflation. We are going to see inflation jump up in the next 1, 2, 3 months, but not to be concerned. That's purely a statistical blip as a result of high oil prices now compared to 12 months ago. And as that works through the system, it averages upwards. So inflation on a trend basis is going to remain under control for the next year or so as well. The other headline grabbing issue, of course, is unemployment. The good news is it's rising more slowly than we had anticipated perhaps 6 months ago, but it is still rising, and it will reach perhaps 2.7, 2.8 million before it peaks at the end of the year. So 3 big figures: GDP 1%, inflation under control between 1 and 2%, unemployment heading towards 2.7, 2.8 million, but maybe not the 3 million that we forecast earlier in the year.
Now, storms leave lots of damage. Patients, when they've gone through some severe trauma, have some nasty scars. What are we left with?
We're left with quite a few scars, and almost too many to list here. But of course, the biggest scar of all is this debt overhang. Debt, personal sector debt, corporate debt, but perhaps most importantly, government debt. And 2 aspects of that. There's the annual borrowing, which is going to head towards 13% of GDP this year alone. £178 billion borrowed by this government to balance the books. But of course that adds to the national debt, the gross public debt. And that's going to head upwards year by year, perhaps to 80% of GDP. Now let's put that in context. That's not as bad as some countries such as Greece and Ireland and Italy, but it is bad by our standards. So the biggest scar will be the debt overhang, which will take many years to pay back. There are other scars, of course, and I think perhaps the biggest one is the damage that's been done to our trust in the banking sector. And I wonder how long that will take to recover, if ever. As I said, this is a financially driven recession, and it's not over yet. So perhaps a third scar is almost the fear of a return of this crisis. So lack of trust, fear, and debt. They'd be my 3 priorities.
So what's the watchword for 2010?
Well, sadly, it's going to be save, be cautious. And that's not good news for the economy. Recovery requires sustained increase in spending by the consumer. We've said that many times, but I still think that this year is a year for caution. And I think consumers and companies are going to be very careful about how much they spend until they're confident that we're out of this recession. And as I say, that will not happen, I believe, until towards the middle to the end part of 2010, and hopefully 2011 will see us smiling again.
Joe, thank you.
Many thanks.